We've all had the misfortune of having to work for a toxic leader, somebody who doesn't believe what's on my shirt. They believe people work for them. And we've all been tempted to leave that toxic leader. But there's a couple things you can do short of leaving that'll help you deal with that toxic leadership long enough to survive. Hey leader, David Burkus here, organizational psychologist and author of 4 best-selling books on helping leaders and teams do their best work ever, including leaders who are led and teams who are led by toxic leaders. Almost every week I get emails from individual viewers or readers of my books or former students of mine when I was an MBA professor who are asking me how to deal with a bad boss, a toxic leader. And you begin to wonder, is every single leader a toxic leader? I mean, I know they're not, but it feels that way. And in fact, there's some research to back that up. In fact, researchers found that in leaderless groups assigned to do a task, it was much more likely that the most confident, the most narcissistic, the most toxic person ended up seizing the reins and becoming the leader of those groups by the end of the task. So in this episode, we're gonna talk about how you can deal with toxic leadership. You may be tempted to leave, and I'll give you a spoiler, that is the 6th tactic. But we're gonna talk about 5 other things you can do to help survive while you can't leave and help set yourself up for success no matter what your ultimate decision is. Let's get started. So the first tactic to deal with toxic leadership is to set boundaries. Control what you can control and try and build as much of a buffer between you and that leader as possible. This means trying to reduce contact with that toxic boss as much as possible, trying to find reasons why you can't be dragged into every meeting, and when you can't avoid a meeting with that person, maybe even scheduling some recovery time where you can kind of decompress from having to deal with that before you have to jump into another meeting and let that negativity rub off on you and then eventually rub off on your colleagues as well. You also want to set boundaries around what you believe is acceptable or not in terms of ethical and moral behavior, anything you know you would want to avoid doing. We know from research that often people who commit unethical acts didn't actually believe in the moment they were unethical because it was a slippery slope. Toxic leadership asked them to do more and more and more. So set that boundary right away of what that line you won't cross is so that you won't be tempted to just give a little bit more, and then you find yourself being toxic as well. These strategies create what's often called psychological distance, a psychological removing between you and the leader. And as much distance as you can create, it's gonna limit the impact that that toxicity has on you, on your emotions, and on your productivity. So set boundaries. The second tactic to dealing with toxic leadership is to document actions. Document everything, every behavior that is increasing the toxicity on the team, every negative slight that you're seeing from that boss, get it documented, especially if nobody else is. You know, when you're in that meeting and your narcissistic boss is berating one of your coworkers for disagreeing with him. So when you have that boss who is berating your colleagues, document the behavior you witnessed him observe, right? Time, date, the specific behavior. You never know when that may be useful for HR or for a senior leader who's asking to deal with the problem. Now you have those records. The other thing it does, is we talked about this in the first tactic, is it creates psychological distance. I learned this trick from my friend, one of my intellectual heroes, Bob Sutton at Stanford University. You know, he calls it almost thinking about yourself as a toxic or a bad boss ethnographer. You're documenting things and you're gaining psychological distance because you're saying, oh, well, what a fascinating example of toxic leadership. You know, like somebody on the National Geographic Channel documenting behavior in the wild. You get some psychological distance because you start to see your role as the ethnographer, as the scientist studying this wonderful example of toxic behavior. It can really help decrease how much that toxic behavior affects you. The third tactic for dealing with toxic leadership is to build support, build connections with your colleagues, build trust with your colleagues. You know, if you have the misfortune of being on a team that's led by a toxic leader, then there's probably not a lot of trust on your team to begin with. And you can kind of step in and begin to replace what that leader should be doing with the trust that your team needs. This will also help increase the amount of social support that individuals on the team are getting. Because we know we may not be able to trust our leader, but we can trust each other. We can come to each other with frustrations. We can help each other brainstorm possible solutions or workarounds or ways to stay on task and be productive despite that leader. But that only happens if we build connections, we build support, and we may even have a leader that's actively working against that, trying to keep everyone disconnected from each other to maintain power. So build support. You're gonna need that support, and if you do, there's a good chance your colleagues do as well. The fourth tactic for dealing with toxic leadership is to avoid drama. Don't get sucked into the drama. This is especially true if you're looking to build support. See, what can happen is as you're trying to build trust and you're trying to build a support system among your colleagues, there may be some people who are more affected by the toxicity than others. And what I mean by that is not that they are negatively effective and they need your support. What I mean is that they choose to respond to that negative with additional toxicity. They choose to create additional drama. We want to avoid what I often call recreational complaining, right? Complaining as a pastime, complaining as a coping strategy, complaining when we have no ability to have our constructive feedback turned into something positive for the team. Drama easily gives way to divisions, to cracks on a team, and to fissures that maybe even a toxic leader wants, because again, then they can maintain power. So we want to avoid drama. We want to build support and connections, but we don't want to do that at the sake of throwing any other team member under the bus or getting the team together to just constantly gripe. The point is we're here for you and we're here to see that behavior end. And the only way to make it end is to make sure it stops with us. The fifth tactic for dealing with toxic leadership is to step up. And I've already kind of been hinting at this already with taking the responsibility of building support and building connections and avoiding drama. There is a leadership void on your team. And if you've watched or listened to this episode for long enough, the chances are you're inspired to do something about it, which means that you may be the most qualified person to step up and fill that leadership void. If you're avoiding drama, if you're building support, you've already started stepping up in that leadership void. But the team may actually need you to take on roles about helping to remove obstacles or helping to try and find additional resources that leader is not actually doing. They certainly need your support, your confidence to counteract that toxicity. And what they may need is for you to confront that leader. I mean, this is a weird twist of fate, right? We already sort of talked about how it's people who suffer from sort of narcissism and overconfidence that end up arriving in leadership roles. And obviously that goes hand in hand with a lack of self-awareness. Sometimes toxic leaders aren't actually aware of how toxic they're being. And they need someone on their team to step up and demonstrate real leadership by giving them feedback on that behavior. And this is not feedback like, hey, you're a terrible boss. We'll cover that in step 6 when you leave. This is feedback about how, hey, I observed this behavior, remember, because we're documenting everything. And I don't know what your intention behind it was, but I feel like perhaps knowing that colleague, this may have been a better approach. Just a little bit of feedback on how they can shift their behaviors might help clue them in on how they're being perceived by the team and might help inspire them to sort of turn it around. They are, after all, often narcissistic and toxic. And their narcissism might actually be the emotion, the personality trait you can tug on to get them to want to be a better leader. They may be forlorn, they may think they're fantastic, in which case we've got another tactic for it. But before you implement step 6 or tactic 6, before you leave, at least try to step up and be the leader your team needs. And that brings us to step 6, which you already knew was coming, and that is leave. If you've tried all of the other tactics, or if you feel like as you're watching or listening to this episode, you've tried them all and that's not gonna work, you have permission to leave. You don't have to stay in a toxic environment. And unfortunately, far too often, people do stay in toxic environments out of fear of the unknown. They don't know necessarily what new career option they have. They are that person that wants to make sure they're never letting go of one vine until they've swung over and grabbed the other one. And I understand that, but you could begin to look for those options. Or you could take the risk and actually just depart without a safety net, without another vine. Consider the fact that we tend to overvalue what we have and undervalue the potential options that are available to us when we do things like depart. Every student that I've counseled around toxic leadership when I was a business school professor, and for every reader of the books that I've put out there, or watchers or listeners to this series, for every single one of them that have actually taken the leap, not a single one of them regrets leaving. And in fact, often their departure and the ensuing exit interview with HR, etc., is what moved the needle and grew the larger organization to awareness that that person was toxic. So not only did they change their own fate, they helped change the fate of the organization by leaving as well. And as you leave, or as you try any of these other tactics, remember to increase the psychological distance so that you decrease the effect that it has on you. In fact, the best way to do that is to elevate yourself beyond just the ethnographer role of, oh, I'm documenting this fascinating example of toxic leadership, to realizing that toxic leaders carry lessons as well. you will be a better leader, whether right away or years down the road, because you unfortunately had to suffer through these experiences and you learned what not to do. And you got to see the differences in options and what better behavior in stressful situations would be. Randy Pausch, the author of the famous Last Lecture, actually summarized it beautifully. He said, short course on leadership. Think of all the bad leaders you've ever had. Don't do what they did. If you do that, if you develop this idea that toxic leadership is a learning laboratory, then you'll not only improve your own ability to do your best work ever down the road, but you'll find yourself leading a team to their best work ever as well. Oh, and one more thing. If you're dealing with a toxic leadership situation, that is obviously having ramifications on your culture as well. So whether you're in a leadership role or not, you're going to want to think about how you can turn around that team culture. So you're going to want to watch this video here on how to fix a broken team culture. This one. This is like the disinfectant for team culture.